Okay. Have you always lived there? Because I saw some of your background and work. Were you over in England at all, or have you always been in Canada?
I lived in South America for a while. Then we moved to Israel for a while, and then I moved to Canada. So I've been all
Wow,
around.
you're very well traveled then. That's
Absolutely.
awesome, man, that's awesome. Well,
Yeah.
man, it's cool to have you on the podcast, and I've been looking at all your work, and you're a very unique author in the sense that you have different style of published works out there, some of it being more professional based, and, now you've got a fiction novel out there, and Lior, I'd love to just know just your story on just your background, your how you grew up, your professional career, and really what led you to publishing work that's so different.
Yeah, well, thanks you for first of all, hosting me. That's really nice of you, and I really like your project as well. Really amazing project. And I grew up in the era with no internet, right? So I'm pretty
Yeah,
old, right? I guess I was around 20 when the internet started to hit, maybe 19, 20.
yeah,
And so I grew up with books, right? That's what we did. Now, what I was born in Venezuela, and I lived
okay,
there for a few years, like until I was 6. Then my parents moved to Israel. Then we moved back to Venezuela when I was, I think, on 5th grade or 4th grade. And that's when I got interested in skateboarding. Skateboarding was big then. You got all kind of movies and stuff, and there was kind of like a really cool movie called Gleaming the Cube. It was kind of like a skateboarding movie with some fictional stuff in it and so on. And by that time, I started skateboarding, and I suddenly saw this kind of like skateboarding magazine
yeah,
in this kind of like shop, and I purchased it. I think it was the first time I bought a magazine. Of course, I got those kids magazines, right? But it was the first time I really chose what I want to read, right? And then I kind of like started reading those magazines, and I was fascinated, not just because of the thing itself, right? The skateboarding
yeah,
itself, the tricks and all those things. Everything around it stylistically and everything around it, I read every word, you know what I mean? And I got to tell you now, when I open those magazines, I can't read them anymore because they always kind of like, they revolve around the same things. What did you do? It's not very interesting nowadays. I mean, of course, they're amazing skateboarders, but then I would read every word, I would actually, and all those, they become my heroes, those skateboarders, Mark Gonzalez, Ray Barbie, Matt Hensley, I felt like I knew them, right? So that's when I started kind of like leaking with print, that's when I started to really say, wow, this is a medium that gives you so much, and I would just kind of like, I had actually 2 subscriptions to the both big magazines, Transworld and Thrasher, and I would
yeah,
read them, end to end with all the competitions, everything. I knew everything, right? And that's where I kind of like started to really fall in love with print. So then when we moved back from Venezuela to back to Israel for a little bit, my mother got me this job at an advertising agency. And they had like the first Mac computers there, and I was just a kid. I think I was 14 or something. And I saw this computer that smiles to you and you can kind of start drawing on it. And then I fell in love with graphic design. I was like, wow, this is crazy. This is like, and then I started getting interested in that as well. So it's kind of like my love for print and that thing really connected very quickly, kind of like in the span of 2 or 3 years. And I started to study those computer stuff and the graphic design and everything. And I started working with Photoshop when I was around 15. Now I'm 48, so that's a long time ago. And I was working on Photoshop 2.5. People don't even remember that thing. It was like so old. It didn't even have layers. And always I was kind of like in this kind of like intersection, the technology and the print media. So it's all about communication in this way or another. So that's really fascinated me. And I always read all kinds of stuff, professional stuff and academic stuff, and every time I kind of like, so it's kind of like I was zigzagging between technical stuff and reading and kind of like the art of writing, right?
yeah,
So when I was kind of like, and I worked in print, all kinds of stuff. And then when I was 24 or 20, I opened my own kind of like skateboarding magazine just for Israel. It was just for that. It was kind of like crossover, skateboarding, surfing, all that stuff. And that's really when everything clicked. So I had like the technical knowledge. I wasn't a very good designer, but I had like the publishing knowledge and things started to So that's, I would say, I mean, I think I wrote it. No, I think that was the first print project I took on myself,
Yeah,
besides doing stuff for clients when I worked at agencies. And I wanted to bring those stories to life as well. So,
right.
again, those different trips, those
Yeah,
competitions, talking to different athletes, getting all the things together. The cool thing about skateboarding, it's not a sport and it's not an art. It's something in between, right? So
yeah,
some people say it's a sport, some people say it's an art form. I believe in the art for more than the sport, right? But so I would say it's kind of like this intersection that you can really create, it created a culture around it. So you can really do interesting stuff, which is not, you don't see that, for example, in the NBA, right? In the NBA, it's all about points. It's all about this guy, that guy. Skateboarding is more about, the culture, the music, all the things around the trips. It's much more interesting in that sense, much more interesting.
yeah.
So
No, that's awesome, Lior. Because I'm similar to you. I grew up really loving skateboarding, snowboarding, motocross, bicycle. I remember I grew up with, like, Tony Hawk at his peak, Kelly Slater, surfing. I remember getting books at our book fair that had the addresses where you could mail your favorite athletes or people letters, and they had, like, fan mail they could send back to you. I don't know
exactly.
where they're at, but I know I've got, like, a Kelly Slater and a Tony Hawk, like, I'm sure their mail person sent it back, but I remember being so excited about that. But it's pretty cool, like, hearing you talk about this, it's taking me back to when I was a kid and, like,
Yeah,
really into those sports, and I watched them all the time. I mean,
yeah,
now, the Olympics, I love, like, snowboarding and all that, that's a part of it, skateboarding in the summer, but I just love hearing your passion for skateboarding specifically because that's just taking
yeah.
me back to what I used to really enjoy paying attention to growing up.
Yeah, and I think those guys, our heroes were really cool, because they had like this thing you could send them a letter and they'll send you stickers back.
Yeah,
So everybody was, yeah, that was a really, I think it's still like this, by the way. I think people are still, even though it's the Olympics and a little bit more money came in,
yeah,
I think that ethos still stands. And this is a testament to the founding fathers of skateboarding that were really,
yeah.
did
I
it right.
remember playing, like, the Tony Hawk video game on my PlayStation
I
and
think
doing all that. That was so much fun.
you're younger than I am. That came a long after that. But before the video game, there was a whole thing about, I think the first video, when Tony Hawk Company's company Birdhouse,
Yeah,
I think, I got one of the first videos. He actually mailed it to me because he was just starting out. And skateboarding was actually in a slump in the
yeah,
90s. The early 90s was going down. It was really high in the 80s, like 85, 86, really exploded. And then in the 90s, really slumped. So I started when it slumped. That's always about my story. When things go down, I get in. When things
yeah,
are popular, I get out. So and yeah, so that's how my passion started with this all media stuff. And
yeah,
then I wrote a few books around graphic design, like the software, and wrote some articles for print magazines and kind of like stuff. So it's not more professional stuff. Yeah, so all the time I've been doing media. I really like to do it independently. I'm not the kind of guy who can send a manuscript and wait around and say, "Oh, when is this guy's gonna call back to me?" That's the DIY thing from skateboarding, right? You build it yourself. You want a ramp, you go and build it. Nobody's gonna build it for you. Nowadays it's a little bit different, but then you have to do everything by yourself. That's the ethos. So
yeah.
yeah, I've kept that. I just couldn't wait for somebody to come and tell me, "Hey, let me publish your book."
Yeah. No, that's awesome. Leor, I got several questions that are popping up in my head for you. But the first one I want to ask you is just because you're so well traveled. You were talking about Israel, Venezuela, now you're in Canada. And I'm curious to know before I get into like your books, just one last question around skateboarding, because skateboarding can be a universal, thing to do, unlike, American football or, and soccer, football is different. But what was your experience growing up with skateboarding in Venezuela versus Israel? Skateboarding popular in both places, or were you one of the few kids who were like, "I love skateboarding," and people are looking at you like, what is this?"
That's a great question. This is exactly this kind of like up and down thing that happens with skateboarding. Skateboarding is a very interesting thing, and I wish I had the time to write a book. Maybe I would, but the thing is, when it started, it could have taken two ways, right? When it started, it could have been one of those, pogo stick things or yo-yo things, which is kind of like this hobby trend. You know what I mean? Kind of like something you do for 1 year and you just shelve it because that was the trend. and
Yeah.
it's gonna become a culture. That intersection is so interesting because it's kind of like those kids, the Dogtown guys that made it what it is. They kind of like injected this culture to it. It became the thing, right? So first of all, that was the first intersection. And then it became kind of like, connected to punk rock, connected to all that kind of stuff, and so on. And some good, some bad,
Yeah.
we can talk about that as well. But when it became a culture, it started to become this grassroots hardcore thing, which already had substance.
Mhm.
And I think that's you can ask, skateboarding is just a board with four wheels, right? And something else like a pogo stick is just like the same thing. It's got a spring. How come you don't have a pogo stick culture, but you have a skateboarding culture, right? It's all about the people who did it. You know what I mean? If
Yeah.
the pogo stick guys were cool, we're going to doing all that stuff. Pogo stick will do the thing now in the Olympics, right? Maybe. But it happened with skateboarding because those guys injected the culture into it and the mindset. So I think that's the universal thing we're talking about.
Yeah.
You're kind of like a part of a family. So when I was doing it in Venezuela, I actually studied at an American school. So
Okay.
everybody was kind of like, we're Americans. And it just made sense. Everybody was skateboarding there. I'm not sure that I met a lot of Venezuelans really skateboarding. And when I came to Israel, it was a little bit big because everybody was still, with it had this kind of like explosion in the 80s. So I came back in the late 80s. But then I got to tell you, like after 3 months, everybody quit.
Yeah.
And I stayed with it. And for the 90s, we were just like maybe in whole Israel, there were maybe like 20 or 30 or 40 skaters, in whole Israel. But it was the
Uh,
same all over the world, by the way. It was the same
yeah.
all over. Tony Hawk talks about it a lot. He was kind of like, barely making a living. He was video editing. That's Tony Hawk, right? The
Yeah.
richest, the guy who was most successful. So it slumped. And then in the 2000, it came up again with the X Games. And
Yeah, I was
that's
about to
where
say
the
the
video,
X Games is what I was thinking about because you have all
exactly.
these people coming from different countries to compete and stuff. So I was
Yeah.
thinking that's why I was curious of the globalization of everybody
Yeah, so
making
it
it
was kinda like
pop.
hardcore, and then it became global. Tony Hawk, the game really helped with that, and the X Games as well.
Yeah.
And then but it was always, something you can communicate with people, right? You can always kinda, like, take it and I mean, skateboarding, I think nowadays it's even more open, but back then it was also open, kind of like, just come with your board, everything is cool. It's not very competitive in the essence, and I think nowadays it's even, more loose because people kind of, like, skate with their own style. When I started, it was very, "Oh, now we do this. This is the trick now. That's an old trick. We don't do those anymore. We do the," and now it's more integrated. So that's kind of cool. It's
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. No, it's cool, man. I love talking about that, Lior, because again, I don't there's not a lot of people in my that talks about it, but hearing you talk about this stuff, it makes me think about all that stuff that I grew up with and loving, and so it's really cool to revisit. And I
yeah,
find myself every summer when the X Games come on, I love when it comes on towards the end of summer because there's really not a lot that it competes with. So I
yeah,
have it on ESPN and I'm watching all of
yeah,
the stuff, so it's pretty cool to just relive that every year. But Lear, I want to transition to your book, Jeremy Carter, because and if I'm not mistaken, is this your first fiction novel that you've written?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's the first one. I took this challenge because I had an idea, right? So I always kind of like, I don't think about I want to write a book. I think about I got this idea. Can I do something with it, right? So sometimes I do art, sometimes I do kind of like other stuff as well because I got some artwork as well. And I got this kind of like idea about, well, it evolved, but the thing was about, what happened if you could surf everywhere in the world? You know what I mean? So the world was kind of like, the buildings and, the hills and everything would be just surfable. So think about that. It came from a friend of mine who also told me this. He was a professional windsurfer. So he
Yeah,
talked about that as well. But I always thought about the concrete wise, he was kind of like thinking about kind of like waves. So we kind of like every time you look at something, you say, "Oh, can I skate on this? This is amazing." Maybe. So the first thing was kind of like, "Oh, I got this kind of like thing in my head, packing all the time." And then I said, "Okay, what can I do this?" And I said, "Wow, that can be kind of like really cool about somebody harnessing this technology."
yeah,
And I said, "Okay, that's nice, but what else?" And then I don't know the process exactly, but I came to this fruition that, oh, it can be kind of like a story about this guy who becomes like this superhero in a sense. And then I started building it backwards, you know what I mean? So I said, "Okay, let's see how this works." And it worked quite nicely, because I'm a comics fan. I'm a Marvel fan for
yeah,
many, many years, right? So I grew up with Batman and all those. I really grew up with this. So I was kind of like thinking about this whole intersection between extreme sports, surfing the world, and all the other things I picked up through life, philosophy. And, it's kind of like the book has a lot of cliche moments, you know what I mean? That you have to have in a book, like the arc and the hero growing up, taking responsibility. I'm not afraid of those, that's fine. That's how we tell stories from ancient times, It started with the Greek. Nobody invented everything for the last 2,000 years, right? You can see the same stories in the Bible. You can see them in, Greek mythology. Everything is the same. So I wasn't afraid of that, but I wanted to bring like a different angle to young readers, in which I instilled a little bit more philosophy, a little bit of more wisdom into it. So when we saw those movies, the Karate Kid and all those, it's kind of like the head is kind of like there's always the master, right? But the master doesn't always give you their source of wisdom. So in this book, I was talking about the Tao Te Ching, the Chinese philosophy a little bit more. So I was trying to kind of like instill a little bit more knowledge. But the thing at the end is it needs to be exciting. It needs to be fun. It needs to be, some twists, some turns. And I think I got it in the book. At least what the reviews were okay with it. I'm a very, I like to write short. I'm not a very good, at exposition and kind of like setting. I'm not very good at that, but I think I'm decent and kind of like creating this plot in
Yeah.
which I want to get from the end to the start. And that's what happens in this book. I kind of like knew where I want to get and build it backwards. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I wanted you to break it down because your book brings in so many different things. I mean, you even talked about the Russian mob getting involved, and you've got so many different aspects to it that you tie in. And I was just curious to know how you came up with, and you explained it, but how you came up with your plot and how you kept it going and adding all these different variables to it. I just think it's a very unique story that's a little bit different and can be very enjoyable no matter what your interests are. But I was just curious your process on how you put that story together. And again, I think it's something too, Leor. You've experienced so many different things in life, and you've been so many different places. So like you have, I don't know if it's different culture that has influence, different interest that has influence. Like, I still find it so fascinating that you've been able to merge your passions of design and sport and then storytelling and writing. Like, you're a very creative person. And I just love learning about how you harness all of those and put them together
Right.
and then put out a book like this that's different than the other work that you've published before.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, thank you. The thing is, I for my life, I learned that everything I studied came handy somehow. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
the graphic design came handy. The other things I learned always came handy. When I opened the Tao Te Ching, it came handy. It's a book with 83 chapters, but it's so genius because every word there means something. The Chinese in that sense are geniuses because it's a very short book, but it's so profound that you can read it all your life. And I wanted to kind of like, instill that knowledge as well because sometimes it's missing. So, for example, I studied martial arts for a few years, in kung fu and stuff. And the guy who taught me never read the book. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like those people, they do the motions, they do the everything. He's an expert, but when I showed him the book, this is the book that talks about what you do. He was like, "Oh, I never read it." So it's really, and it's kind of like the master, right? So I was a student, but he was the master. So, I found out that people, and this is very important, I think, an aspect that maybe I was trying, subconsciously bring to the book is that a lot of people don't understand why they do what they do. You know what I mean? So they
Yeah.
do things, they don't really go, why am I doing what I'm doing, right? And when you start going back, you might find, the wisdom in all things that you say, oh, you can find it in advertising very well. I do advertising as well. So, when I teach advertising, I always go to the old campaigns. The new ones, they're not as good, because those guys were limited. They were limited by technology. They were limited by space. They were limited by so many things that limitation brought great things from them, right? So what I'm trying to say is that I wanted to give a little bit more background, a little bit more philosophy. So not just punching and fighting and killing some bad guys, which is always, something you want to have. You want to have this kind of like discourse. You want the hero to reveal themselves. You want them to have the training era or the mentorship. Everything is in there, right? But it's a
Yeah.
little bit different in that sense. And now the book is also based on the fact that, I don't want to reveal a lot of it, but you have like this alien thing as well hanging around there, right? So he found the diamond, and I never tell where it came from, what's inside, what does it mean. But there is a story behind that as well, right? So it's kind of like built to further exploration. Right now, the story is that he finds the diamond, he understands there is power to it, but the power is actually external. They have to use it inside the machine to create the grid so he can surf on it. So that's very important as well. It's kind of like outside of him. So it's not like he's really a superhero. He's just using that thing. But as the books, if I can write them, if I have the time, evolve, the story behind it is also interesting. So it's kind of like this little kind of like just first chapter of this story.
Yeah. Yeah, no, again, I don't yeah, don't share too much more because I want people to pick it up and read it, and we've got it on the Books4Guys website, so anyone who's interested in learning more about it can go click on it and then go purchase it, but that did lead me to another question, Lear, and I've just a couple more for you. Is this gonna be a series for you, or is this a one book? And I guess the other question was, if it's not a series, do you have plans for future fiction books that you're wanting to write, or do you have new ideas that you're thinking about, and what do those look like?
I really hope to expand this, but again, it's I'm doing everything DIY, right? So I write
Yeah.
it, I edit it. Of course, people help me, and I have a publisher as well. But it's not an easy thing to do. So I do have already another book, which I wanted to be the same topic, but a graphic novel this
Okay.
time, not just a book, just a graphic novel that I outlined. So yeah, I want to expand it. I think there is a lot of substance in that. I'm talking about myself, self-indulging, but I think that when you kind of like look at this character versus things I've seen, I think I got a lot of ways I can expand this in an
Yeah.
interesting way. And I'm not saying it's, the level of Harry Potter or those things. But I'm saying that it can become, for example, an animation. It can become a graphic novel. It has a lot of ways to go because it's very open. So I wish I could. I really wanted to create some videos around it, some animations around it. That would be very nice
Yeah.
because I think in a lot of mediums and not just books, storytelling is everywhere, right?
Yeah.
But I think books are super important. My kids, I buy them books all the time. I really love books. But I think sometimes you wanna have this back and forth between
Yeah.
different medias because you can tell the story a little bit differently.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that, and I can't wait to see what all you do and what paths you decide to take. I mean, I love too that you give yourself the flexibility to take the time to go down the path that you think's the right path with whatever your next journey is with this story or these characters or whatnot. Some people, I think, try to force things, and I like that you give yourself the flexibility to decide what you think is best to do next. But Leor, I got one more question for you, and this one may be a tough one, especially if you've been a reader your whole life. And so I'm always curious, and this answer can change obviously based off what season you're in of life or what you're doing. But I'm always curious to know what some of your favorite books have been and what books have meant a lot to you, either personally or professionally. And if asked, what book do you like to recommend to others?
Well, that's always a tough question because, you read so much, but I think you always go to the first ones you read in life, kind of like, I really like Mark Twain. He was always my favorite
Yeah.
writer. So Huckleberry Finn and those books were always, my mother recommended it to me. And I think Mark Twain is one of the, smartest people ever lived. I still go back to his quotes and his funny quotes and everything. So definitely those books were the ones that, instilled some of the love, now that I look back, right?
Yeah.
And, moving forward, when I was a teenager, it was more a little bit more, I would say more anarchistic writers, but and George Orwell, for example, those kind of books which are a little bit more adversary. As I moved more, I liked more like short stories. That's really my thing. Even this novel that I created, it's not very long. I'm not very good at long formats. I'm very good at short format.
Yeah.
So short stories, I like Henry Rollins, for example. I don't know if you know him. Henry Rollins writes all these kind of like little books, short
Okay.
books about his life, his travel,
Yeah.
and always in a very interesting way. And so kind of like books where it became a little bit more journals, a little bit more, But professionally, I read so many things as well, for
Yeah.
my line of works. But I would say if I go back, somebody tells me, hey, I would say it's probably Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain. Yeah,
Yeah.
about so.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, Lior, man, thank you so much for doing this. And
Yeah,
like I
I
said,
really
we've got your book, Jeremy Carter, on the website. I'm gonna work on getting your other books on there as well. And man, can't wait to see again, like we were talking about. I can't see what paths you decide to take and your next journey and what you decide to work on. And now, I always say now that we've met, it's gonna be really cool to follow your work and see what all you continue to do. And so, man, thank you so much for doing this, and we're excited to have you on today.
Thank you very much for everything you do. I really like the project, and more power to you. And let's get the kids reading, right? Before they go to the computers.
Yeah, that's the goal, man. That's the goal. So, thank you, Lior.
Take care. Bye bye.